Welcome, everybody. Thank you for that welcome, Ashish. So many welcomes in one sentence. Very, very cool. OK, so I am Priyanka. I'm Director of Technical Evangelism here at GitLab. I also serve on the board of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, where I've done a bunch of work on observability with the Open Tracing and Jaeger projects. And that background, actually, is what made me really excited about this panel, where we're going to be talking about data engineering. So why did cloud native and observability make me excited about that? Well, simply because as systems are getting more complex, as more and more people are adopting cloud native, the amount of data emitted by systems is exponentially increases. Just the number of microservices means there's that many more edges, that many more data points. You know, just today I was talking to someone from T-Mobile who's going to do, I think, a live demo afterwards here, Philip. And he mentioned that when they started using GitOps, they ended up getting 50 billion data points to Elasticsearch in a 30-day test period. They filled up 600 gigabytes. That's the kind of data leaders like this help us process. So that's what we're going to talk about, cloud native and data engineering today. So with that, I'd love to get some intros going. Maybe this is the only time we're going to do this, ladies, but let's go in order. And everyone introduce yourself.
Okay, so hi guys, my name is Priyanjna Sharma. I am a DataOps implementation engineer at a company called DataKitchen. We're based out of Boston. What I basically do is orchestrate and automate data pipelines, right from extracting data, processing, cleaning, ingesting, and then finally delivering it in form of reports or analytics. And we're very focused on data ops, and we're very focused on spreading the idea of data ops across.
I'm Danielle Morrill. I'm the GM of Meltano, which is a small startup within GitLab. So we're building a DataOps pipeline tool kind of in the vein of what GitLab did for DevOps, we want to do for data. I was previously CEO and co-founder of Mattermark and the first employee at Twilio, so my career spans data and APIs for the past 10 years.
My name is Emilie Schario. Until last week, I was a data engineer at GitLab. I was the first data analyst at GitLab when I started a year and a half ago. And today, I'm an internal strategy consultant at GitLab.
And I'm Claire Carroll. I'm the community manager for open source data tool DBT, which is part of Meltano and is used by the GitLab team. I work based out of Philadelphia, but before this, I lived in Sydney, which is where I'm from, and I was a one-person data team for about a 120-person startup.
Awesome. Thank you for that, ladies. So just FYI for the audience, and I think I already talked to you guys about this. I'm not going to ask a question, then go in order. We're going to just have people jump in, make this a real conversation, because in my opinion, that's kind of what makes panels fun. Another thing, I've spent the last months prepping everybody for GitLab commit, so I forgot to prep myself. And so I brought my phone for the questions. So when I'm looking, I'm not texting on stage, just FYI. OK, oh, and also, the timer here isn't running if anyone cares. I don't. We can keep going. But I thought I'd let the folks know. All right. So as I was saying when we just got started, data and data engineering takes on a whole new meaning in the world of cloud native, from my perspective anyway. Would any of you like to jump in and share your thoughts on cloud native and how it's impacted your jobs?
I think there is a really natural instinct for people who are good at their jobs to be faced with a problem and have a gut answer. And what we're seeing in this new approach to data-driven decision-making, or decision-making, that the new approach being that it's data-driven, is that people are often finding that the data is confirming their gut reaction anyway. We're not reinventing the wheel, but we're empowering people with more confidence in the decisions they're making. And that allows them to go faster. That's really changing how they're working and the impact they're having in their work.
So just to double click on that, even though the amount of data is exponentially growing, the sort of like leadership intuition is kind of usually on point, is what you're saying, but the data can like now really support that.
Yeah, I think people who are experts, and so,
Right.
you know, I'm looking at Ray right in front of me. You know your community well, and so the answers he asks of the data, they might be helpful, but his gut reaction is telling him what questions to ask in the first place. And I think that's what we see throughout the organization at GitLab in terms of questions we ask about data in our day-to-day lives. It is really a matter of making us more confident in the things we thought we knew or already knew.
That's very interesting.
Well, I would like to talk about data engineering as a whole new perspective today because of so many new technologies that have evolved, and you know, being cloud native, data is coming from very different sources. It's coming from web APIs. It's coming from you know, streaming, live streaming data. It's coming from social. So all this data is different in format, and it's very difficult to process all this different type of data. And data engineering today is not just about ETL. It's about orchestrating different ways of accessing these different sources of data, and then creating pipelines and managing CI/CD of data engineering rather than just ETL.
So that almost starts to sound like a software developer's workflow, does it?
Is it not?
Well,
Yeah, last night we were talking a bit about this workflow experience and talking about how maybe it sounds like software development, but in some ways it's like we're 10 years behind. There's a lot of things that software developers do, the data engineers are just starting to do, a big one being version control. I'm kind of teeing you up here because I feel like you've been talking about this a lot lately.
So I think about version control and CI/CD particularly. At GitLab, we use DBT, and I've been using DBT for a couple years in my career. And I think DBT is really one of the tools that's changing the data industry, particularly in this version control space, where your business logic, instead of being in graphical UIs, is being version controlled in code. And then the piece of that is when you're now deploying your DBT changes, much like you would deploy a software change, where you're running your CI/CD pipelines to make sure you're not introducing anything you shouldn't be. And so we're really starting to adopt those software best practices.
and for the audience, what does DBT stand for?
Data build tool. That was a very easy question. Yeah, data build tool. It's just a tool that can help data teams transform their data so that it's ready to be used for analytics. Because as Priyanjna was saying, so many companies use so many different data sources, and you know, you might use Zendesk for your customer support, and Zendesk returns an API, like their API returns the created timestamp as created_timestamp, and everyone who's using a Postgres database returns it as created at. And you know, even simple things like cleaning up data. So frequently, and I think it might be worth to sort of touch on what that workflow used to look like, because we're speaking to a room full of people who are used to version control and are like, what do you mean that's not, you know, part of the typical workflow? Typically, a lot of analytics teams who don't have data engineering resources just held all those things in their head. Oh, okay, in Excel, that column means that thing, and I've got to rename that that particular table, and that foreign key, is adjoined, the customer ID is actually adjoined to the user's ID. And you end up with these analysts who know so much about the business, but it's all stuck in their head. And whenever anyone needs a question answered, this analyst becomes a bit of a bottleneck. It's frustrating for them, it's frustrating for the organization. So what we're really passionate about as a company and part of the community that we're building is really empowering analysts to have the tools and the frameworks available to them so that they can own more of the data stack. They do often know the business better than a lot of other people in the company. When I was at my last startup, one of our API engineers said, we have 150 tables in production, and each engineer knows one area of the code base and one data model. Except for Claire, she knows all 150 tables. Like, she can tell you what's happening in all of them. What we're really focused on at the moment is teaching analysts how to apply software engineering practices to their own work so that they can learn to really scale themselves, the same way that software engineers have learned to write reusable code, maintainable code, test it, continuous deployment, continuous integration. All of that basically means that you're not doing the same work twice, and instead you can move more quickly. So that's what we're super passionate about, myself included.
I can see it. You're definitely very passionate about it. This is a question to both you, Danielle, and you, Claire. I'm one of those people who's like, wait, you guys aren't using version control? Like, then what are you doing? And so my question is, how did we end up in a situation where data engineering is 10 years behind? Like, why? Because I think of you data folks as engineers, and so I'm just curious if there are any historical reasons why this is the case, or current reasons why this is no longer going to be the case. I'd love to hear both.
I mean, we probably both have lots of stories, but definitely one big one is a lot of times, historically, the analyst is tasked with solving a business problem that needs an answer now. So like the CEO saw something weird this morning, and they need to run a report, and they need to get the data, and they need to make a decision. And so historically, I think there was less trust in these tools, and it was more like, I'm going to use the tool that can do the job. I'm going to use the spreadsheet. This is a one-off. But pretty quickly you realize, this isn't a one-off. This problem has popped back up, and that's when you begin to say, well, I should probably automate this and check this regularly, and that's the domain of software development. But because a lot of these people didn't view themselves as engineers, they didn't go to the engineering field and say, wow, there's these good practices over here, we should use them. They just kept doing it manually, and many of you have probably helped people like this to automate things. And that change is both scary. It can feel like it's taking away job security of an analyst, but it's also powerful because then this really smart person, look at the people who who are analysts in companies. Do you really want them to be a data monkey doing transforms? That's not really the best use of their brain power. But it's been a slow change, and I think partly there's not been as much communication between the two fields till now.
Yeah, I absolutely second that. I think one of the words that we talk about a lot is empowering analysts to operate with leverage. So instead of being stuck on that hamster wheel, just leveling up and operating with leverage. I think the reason that we're sort of in this mess a little bit is definitely the tooling around things. In the past, if you needed data, let's say from Zendesk, a data engineer had to write the script to hit that API, turn it from a JSON response into a relational structure in a data warehouse. But there are thousands, actually I don't know for sure, hundreds at least, thousands maybe of companies using Zendesk. So instead, these data pipelines as a service tools came out. The Singer framework is an open source framework, and there's tools to manage that, deploy, so that you don't have to think about scheduling and all those things. You get a nice web app that does that for you, and it runs the Singer taps. Similarly, 7 or 8 years ago, a lot of the companies that I work with, we do consulting as well, who set up 7 or 8 years ago, they had to build their own data warehouse technology. If they wanted to run analytical queries and Postgres wasn't up to the job, they had to stand up Skull, I don't even know what these things, Hadoop, and all these crazy things just to answer the question of how much did we sell yesterday? And now we've got Snowflake. I'm a huge proponent of Snowflake. BigQuery, Redshift. Redshift was the real game changer here. So we've got this and on the other end, BI tools are allowing people to be more self-service as well, putting the power in the hands of the end users. So we've got all these product changes happening. And we also have this increasing trend, I think, across the entire software industry for people to be more self-service. People want to be able to do this themselves. And it's interesting to think, who's leading who there? Is it the product that's enabling people to be more self-service? Or is it the people's desire? Your person that's sitting in finance, your growth marketing manager, the people who are data savvy, their desire to be more self-service, encouraging the product market. But those sorts of things, that landscape has changed massively in the last 5 years. I've been in this field for 3 years, and that's eons in this industry. So we're sort of just catching up to where the product and sort of the culture is going to at the moment, and learning how we can build frameworks and best practices in this new sort of space we're in.
That's very interesting. Priyanjna, as an implementation engineer, I bet you see a lot of different customers. So are you noticing similar trends of tools enabling people, but there also being like a lot of tools?
Well, I think as an implementation engineer, I talk to different clients every day, and everybody love their own tools. They don't want to change the tools they use. And most of the people I have met, they are not well educated on this front. So they don't know that we can even use version control in data engineering. So I think, as Danielle said, we are 10 years behind in data engineering than DevOps.
Wow. And so is it part of your repertoire to introduce version control?
Yes, so as a DataOps implementation engineer, I would say that DataOps is basically improvising or improving productivity of your data analytic pipelines by implementing the best practices of Agile, DevOps, and statistical process control into creating analytic pipelines. And you can do it very easily by implementing steps like using version control, and as Claire said, using branching and merging, adding tests at each step in your pipeline, having multiple environments to test your code, to develop the code, and to productionize the code. So these are very simple steps, and these are just ideologies that you need to implement. It's not a technology.
So it's a just do it kind of a thing? Like don't be lazy, come on?
Yes, you need to buck up.
So as you all know, GitLab started as open source version control. So Danielle and Emilie, you folks probably feel very passionate about that. So I'd love to hear from you all, Danielle, about just what's possible once one is on version control. And sorry, I put two questions together, got really excited. And Emilie, from you on how it's different being on being a data engineer with version control versus without your personal experience. So whoever can start, sorry.
Sure. I mean, I'll start and then hand it off to you. So I mean, I love this audience. Like, I'm sure you know what's great about version control, but if you can remember a life before version control, then that's a great way to get empathy for what a lot of data analysts go through. I would say the best thing that an analyst gains, and I want to hear what you think, is just not doing rework. So it's extremely painful. Actually, my first apartment in San Francisco, my roommate was an actuary, and she was like, okay, I'm so sleep deprived. Please wake me up every 2 hours. I have to press a button so my long-running macro will keep running to process the data I need for my meeting tomorrow morning. So, of course, I'm like, I can't believe I'm doing this, but yes, I'm waking her up every 2 hours. She misses one of the button pushes. I don't know if she messed it up or what, and lost everything. And by the way, this is like a Fortune 500 insurance company. This is not like some shop. So I think there's just scenarios like that and that wasn't like 10 years ago. That was like a year ago. So I just think there's stories like this where you just realize you're losing hundreds and hundreds of hours, and of course, unproductive meeting, and then the whole process begins again.
You know, that's actually happened to me. Not in a Fortune 500 situation, but I was doing a demo day for fun with my team, and we were trying to pull some data, and I had to click this button to keep the query running, and I missed it, and it was all gone. It's very sad. So I feel it.
I mean, we should kind of be version controlling almost everything.
Yeah. I'm going to tell a story for a second. And if any of you have experienced something similar, I'll ask you to raise your hand. But I had a job before GitLab where I probably spent 80% of my time reconciling two spreadsheets that different executives had, where they had different numbers for the same metric, right? If you've ever seen that happen, where it's like, I think we have this many customers, but this sheet says like 1.5 times that. So how many customers did we have last month? If you've ever had something like that, can you yeah, right? let me tell you, I spent way too much time in a previous role trying to figure out what was going on. And I think the advantage of version control and this like project-based workflow where we're storing our code in one space and the whole data team has access to it. And if you're interested, actually, our GitLab data project is available online, and people reference it all the time. You're welcome to go take a look at it at gitlab.com/gitlab-data. And the cool thing is we're making sure we're not producing numbers different ways. So when we talk about what is GitLab's MRR, like the code for how we calculate that is there, and everyone has access to it. There's not some Excel macro in this sheet and a different Excel macro in that sheet, and we're producing different numbers and nobody knows why. We've written the process in code, and it's there, and everyone can see it. And so it's not just a matter of making sure we're not repeating work. It's also making sure we're doing it the same way every time.
Consistency.
Absolutely.
Makes a lot of sense.
I mean, to add to that, you need version control to collaborate with your team members and not step on each other's code. You need version control for a disaster recovery mechanism. Let's say your build fails and you need to go back to an older version of code, and this will eliminate any downtime in your production.
That makes so much sense to me. Let's check if we are preaching to the choir, or like let's get an audience check. So how many folks here agree that data engineering people should use version control?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. And how many folks here, the companies you work at, the data engineering people actually use version control?
It's a lot less than raised their
5%?
hands the first time.
And what about your analysts? How many of your analysts use version control? We've got one.
Yeah.
They should all be using it as well.
Yep. Yeah. So we all have our work cut out. You all go home, get your data engineering teams to get on version control. Then they can use Meltano. All works out. But okay, so the reason I did that was just to, I think where we're at is everyone, at least everyone in the know, agrees that version control is the way to go. Oh, sorry. Everyone in the know knows that version control is the way to go. But clearly that's not happening so as much as we would like it to. So what are some specific roadblocks, and how can folks overcome them?
Yeah, so this is kind of my career story, is that for every job I've been hired into, I've been the first data analyst. And in those circumstances, independent of the size of the startup that I've worked at, you kind of have a series of cobbled together tools. And I think the reason companies can get away with hiring data analysts first instead of data engineers today is because of so many of the SaaS tools that Claire was talking about. You don't need a DBA to manage your data warehouse anymore. You can buy that from Snowflake. You don't need to build your own ETL pipelines anymore. You can use Stitch or Singer or something, Meltano, to get your data into your warehouse. You can use open source DBT to do your data transformations. You can use Meltano or Redash or any of the BI tools on the space. So you don't need to build all that stuff anymore. Mm-hmm. That does mean the analyst has to figure out where to start. And I think the question then becomes is, what is the role of the analyst? Is it to help you build your data team and your data infrastructure, your reporting infrastructure that's going to empower your organization with the metrics that they need? Or is it to give you this one-off report all the time?
Right.
And if the answer is the former, then they can start with just version control. And with really great tools like GitLab, you can get started with version control in the UI. You don't have to even learn what the terminal is.
So just so I understand what you're saying, as Claire was referred to as this, like there's a lot of tools out there. There's Snowflake, there's Therscope, this, that. So there's so many tools that people are not getting to the version control? Is that kind of what you said?
Well, it's that you don't need to start with an engineer to build out a data function anymore.
and they are still connecting version control and engineering work.
Exactly. What we're seeing is the rise of this analytics engineer. That's the data analyst who's stepping into this engineering role and setting up your data infrastructure for self-service, for analysis, for empowering your organization with metrics, without the need to have a data engineer who's, managing EC2 clusters.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so to connect it to how we work at GitLab, a lot of you in the room know folks that you've helped when they joined GitLab, if you're a GitLabber, and for the rest of you, not everybody has ever made an MR before they joined GitLab. And it can be a little daunting if you're in marketing or if you're in sales and you want to change something and you get a little bit of help. But pretty quickly it becomes clear that that's an awesome workflow because now you have a place for discussion, collaboration, you can see the history of what came before you. But that's something fairly unique to our culture, and I think more and more companies are starting to do this. But I think part of what is underlying a lot of this is the belief that that's the future, regardless of your function, because you want to collaborate with people outside of your functional area. I don't want to just work with the marketers or the salespeople and kind of look at them as like silos. I want to look at it in terms of a result that I want. And so I think that we're riding the wave of another trend that's happening, which is how do we get work done in general. And that's, I believe, part of what GitLab is enabling. So as you see kind of, if you look at the MR count, obviously you're going to see engineers have a lot more because that's the workflow that they're in. But the cool thing, and actually we should pull this data, is seeing how many MRs are being created by non-engineering roles. And I think that's the trend that we're part of that wave.
That makes sense. So I want to ask one last question, and then hopefully we'll have time for 2 from the audience. I'll ask one last question, and then hopefully we'll have time for 2 from the audience. So each of you, if you had a one-line piece of advice on do this to get your data teams on version control, what would you say? Maybe you should start since you probably help people do this every day.
I would say implement DataOps and get educated on DataOps.
I mean, I would say just show them the way the first time. Like, make it not scary. Make it feel like there's very little risk.
Like it a lot.
I'd have them test an assumption and let it be wrong.
Yeah, I think the most valuable thing that you can do is pair with someone who hasn't made a pull request before. Sorry, a merge request. I'm so sorry. I work with a lot of clients across both things. So sorry. Git is scary if you've never used it before. Sit with them, spend 30 minutes, doing a very simple Git workflow, and you'll be amazed at like the light bulb that goes on in someone's head. But otherwise, it's just really scary. So,
fair enough. Now, audience, there's a question there. Emilie, would you please? So I saw that hand and then this hand. So that's the second person. But fine, go.
Can I take it? Can I not? So you all have talked a lot about how data engineering can learn from software engineers, but software engineers often don't make the right decision. How can software engineers learn from data engineers?
Ooh. I wish I'd planted this question. This is so good.
Go, Claire, go.
Well, I think more broadly, like, what can software engineers learn from data teams, especially analytics teams? Analytics teams are super focused on delivering business value and stay very close to what the entire business is doing. Often, analysts can be like the canaries in the gold mine, where they see what's happening in the business. They're like, oh. Software engineers, I know some software engineers who really just want to work on the piece of code that they're working on and not think about the business problem that they're solving. So I think that's one thing that I'm not going to say all, that some software engineers can learn from data teams is, consider, every single one of you, really consider the business value that you're delivering and understand how a business works.
That makes a lot of sense. Anyone else? That's great. Solid.
I think Claire nailed it.
The next question, I know, yes, that person. Light jacket. Yes.
So what advice do you have to someone who's sitting on a mound of 25 years worth of Excel workbooks?
I'm going to repeat the question. To make sure I heard you, what advice do we have for folks who are sitting on 25 years of, did you say Excel workbooks? Workbooks? Get a
I
therapist?
love Excel.
No, go ahead, Claire.
I love Excel so much. Oh my gosh, I miss using it.
I don't.
That's fine.
I like Excel. Sorry.
We're still friends, it's fine.
I would say I graduated 2.5 years back. I did my master's, and I don't know anything about Excel workbooks. So you need to go up.
So I will say that is the reality at a lot of organizations is you have legacy numbers or processes that are based in other tools and not code. The best thing you can do is stop the bleeding. So start changing going forward. You're going to have to maintain what's there. But I talk about this, and I would love to write a blog post on this someday. But I talk about this 3-tiered framework for data analysis, where the first tier is just developing your business facts. And this is where you're getting buy-in from your organization in the numbers that your data team is producing. And I call this toll paying. And this is where you match the numbers that are coming out of those Excel workbooks before you move on to something else. Because otherwise, if people don't trust your numbers, nothing that your data team does is going to matter. So start by paying tolls.
So I know we're...
I have a draft in an MR right now if you want to talk about it after this.
It's probably open source, so
That's
you can probably find
amazing.
it.
It is open.
Content team very happy. So I know we're at time. There was like one more question. Can we please? Thank you.
Oh, sure, thanks. Yeah, so there was mention of version control like in UIs and also like merge requests being made by non-engineers at GitLab. Are those merge requests without code, and like how does version control with user interfaces work?
So the GitLab Web IDE is pretty snazzy.
Amazing.
We version control things like our documentation. So, people can chip in there, but also there are different approaches to data modeling, and we follow a very wide table approach, denormalized model, and sometimes things that you're updating are like where clauses, which you don't have to write code to like be able to update a where clause sometimes. That's the kind of thing we open up.
SQL is code. That's one of the things that I find really interesting. You ask an analytics team who can write SQL, most of them will put their hand up, and then you say who can write code, and they don't put their hand up. So these people are, they are writing code already, really. We've taught many people how to make a merge request. I got it right that time, to SQL, and it's just transformational.
Yeah, even just any work we do. So in the product demo today, Dan Gordon showed the issue board, right? And in that, similarly, there are issue boards I work with, and it's like, oh, reach out to, let's say, awesome ladies in data engineering. And then you have things you can check off to cross your work through. So that's just like project planning. But then if I'm writing a blog post about this panel, then I'll just write it in the web ID using Markdown and then push a merge request, and then the process goes through. I don't need to go use Terminal or Sublime or whatever at all. I could if I chose to, and there are situations where I will, but day to day, it's super easy. But anyway, with that, we're more than out of time. Thank you to the hosts for letting us go extra, and thanks, audience.